What if I told you that a single meal, something as ordinary as a bowl of soup, saved the lives of hundreds of female German POWs in America during World War II? It's a story so strange, it feels like something from a movie. But this is real. This is history. The year is 1943. World War II is raging across Europe, and the United States is deeply involved in the fight. In the wake of the war, tens of thousands of soldiers were captured by American forces, including a significant number of German prisoners of war, POWs. While most of them were men, there were also women, German soldiers who had been taken prisoner and sent to America, where they faced harsh conditions. For the female POWs, the situation was even more dire. They were caught in the turmoil of a war they had little control over, held in camps far from home, and subjected to the unknown horrors of captivity. The daily grind of military life had already taken a toll, and now, in the camps, they had to struggle to survive. The conditions were abysmal: poor rations, long hours of forced labor, and a lack of basic necessities. These women, once soldiers on the battlefield, were now helpless prisoners in a foreign land. Hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. But one day, everything changed. It wasn't a weapon, a war strategy, or some daring escape. No, it was a meal so ordinary, yet so profound, that would alter the course of their fate in a way no one could have predicted. The meal in question was simple, nothing extravagant, just a bowl of soup. It wasn't even a rare delicacy. Yet, this meal was different. The way it was prepared, the kindness shown, the small gesture, it gave these women something they hadn't felt in weeks: hope. The story goes that this meal was served under unexpected circumstances. The women were being treated in a POW camp where the conditions were harsh, but not as bad as others. There had been a shift in how the guards interacted with the prisoners, perhaps a change in leadership, perhaps a glimmer of humanity amidst the chaos of war. On that particular day, the meal was more than just food. It was a sign that the women were being treated like people, not just enemies. It wasn't just soup. It was a symbol. For the first time in months, they felt something beyond survival. They felt seen, and that made all the difference. You see, the way this meal was presented, the way it was shared, created a moment of connection between the prisoners and their captors. It wasn't a miraculous cure for starvation or a heroic act of resistance, but it was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity could shine through. The ripple effect of that meal was profound. It gave the women something to hold on to, something that wasn't just about surviving, but about living. And it was this unexpected kindness, this small act of humanity, that would help some of them make it through the war. They would go on to survive the brutality of the camps, and many of them would carry this memory with them for the rest of their lives. The setting is the mid-1940s, and the United States is deeply entrenched in World War II. The German military had been making waves across Europe, but as the war reached its peak, the tides began to turn. With the collapse of the Third Reich looming, Allied forces began capturing thousands of German soldiers. Among them were not only men, but also women, including a group of German soldiers and nurses who had been swept up in the chaos of war. These women were placed in various POW camps across the United States. While they were seen as enemies by their captors, they were still women, often struggling with the same fears, anxieties, and physical toll that any soldier, male or female, experienced in the throes of war. The conditions in these camps were harsh. It was a time of scarcity, and food, warmth, and comfort were luxuries that could scarcely be afforded, even to the prisoners. Women who had once been part of an elite force, trained to survive on the battlefield, now found themselves in situations where basic survival became their only focus. But even amidst the squalor and deprivation, something remarkable was brewing in the hearts of those holding the POWs. While the guards were often harsh and indifferent, a few began to recognize the humanity in the women they were guarding. This shift in perspective did not come overnight, and it was not necessarily universal. However, a particular group of guards and camp officials began to see these women not as enemies to be broken, but as individuals caught in the web of something far beyond their control. Now let's shift the focus back to the meal that, as history would remember, played an integral role in the survival of these women. To understand its significance, we need to think beyond the food itself. Yes, the meal was a humble one, a soup, not a five-course feast, but a life-sustaining bowl of broth, potatoes, and a few vegetables. The ingredients were simple, and yet the meal represented so much more. In a world where prisoners were often given nothing but the barest minimum, a meal like this spoke volumes. In one particular camp, a group of female POWs had been enduring weeks of illness, hunger, and fear. The guards, who had been tasked with overseeing the prisoners, had grown weary of their own frustrations and doubts. The war had taken its toll on everyone, even the soldiers tasked with keeping these women in line. Some of the POWs had grown visibly sick from malnutrition, others from the intense conditions of confinement, and a few had even begun to lose the will to keep going. That's when something changed. The moment of change came on a cold afternoon. The camp had been unusually quiet, the typical sounds of grinding metal and clanging pots replaced by a pervasive stillness. The women were lined up for their daily rations, which usually consisted of a meager portion of stale bread and watered-down soup. It was the same bland meal they had been receiving for weeks. But on this day, something was different. As the women filed into the mess hall, they were greeted with an unusual sight. The guards, standing alongside the camp cooks, had been working diligently to prepare something special. It wasn't anything extravagant. In fact, it was just a simple soup, but it was made with care. The vegetables were fresh, the broth rich and flavorful, and there was a sense of pride in how it was served. It was clear that this was no ordinary meal. The women were at first suspicious. It wasn't that they didn't trust their captors. It was more the fact that after months of hardship, their expectations had been drastically lowered. They were accustomed to meager portions, bland foods, and the feeling of being utterly invisible. But something about this moment felt different. The air felt lighter, as if the harsh weight of captivity had been lifted, if only for a moment. The soup was ladled into bowls, and the women were allowed to take as much as they could eat. For many of them, it was the first time in weeks that they had been given more than the bare minimum. They ate with a hunger not just for food, but for the very idea of nourishment, the sense that they were being taken care of, even if only for a brief moment. They could feel the warmth of the broth as it filled their stomachs, the warmth of being cared for as human beings and not just prisoners. It wasn't just the physical nourishment that made the meal so special. It was the symbolism behind it. For the first time, the women felt as though their suffering had been acknowledged. The guards, who had previously treated them with a cold, impersonal demeanor, had now extended a small act of kindness. The meal, though small in its physical offering, became an act of compassion that transcended the confines of the camp. As they ate, the women began to share stories of their lives before the war, of the families they had left behind, and the moments they cherished before being torn apart by the brutality of conflict. It was in this moment, as they shared the warmth of a simple soup, that they began to form bonds, not just with each other, but with the people who had once been their captors. The atmosphere of the camp subtly shifted that day, as the guards, seeing the gratitude in the women's eyes, began to realize the impact of their actions. This small, seemingly insignificant meal marked the beginning of a slow and steady transformation within the camp. Over time, the guard began to take a more humane approach, offering the women more food, more dignity, and more respect. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of cruelty, and the women still endured the hardships of war. But that single bowl of soup, that one unexpected act of kindness, changed the tone of the camp forever. It's important to understand that the significance of this meal wasn't just about the food itself. It was the emotional connection that it sparked, the idea that survival wasn't just about enduring, but about maintaining a sense of humanity even in the darkest of times. The soup was a symbol of hope, of compassion, and of the possibility that even in the most dire circumstances, people could still come together and show care for one another. As the days passed, the women began to notice that the meal had sparked something deeper within them. It wasn't just the physical nourishment that had helped them endure, but the psychological and emotional healing that had begun to take place. They had been living in survival mode for so long that they had almost forgotten what it felt like to be human. But the meal had reminded them. Some of the women began to form deep connections with the camp's kitchen staff, helping with the cooking and even exchanging stories in their broken English. This seemingly small act of cooperation led to an unspoken bond of respect between the prisoners and their captors. The soup had bridged a gap between them, creating a space for empathy, understanding, and eventually trust. Over the months that followed, the women began to heal, both physically and emotionally. They were still prisoners, still at the mercy of their captors, but the memory of that meal stayed with them. They knew they weren't invisible. They knew they weren't forgotten. And that knowledge gave them the strength to continue, to survive, and to look forward to the day when they would finally be free. The legacy of that meal didn't end with the women who experienced it. Years later, when they spoke about their time in the camps, they often recalled the significance of that moment. It wasn't the meal itself, but the way it had made them feel, seen, heard, and, above all, human. It was an act of kindness in the midst of unimaginable suffering, and it reminded them that even in the darkest hours, compassion could still shine through. And so, the story of that strange meal became a symbol of survival, of hope, and of the small moments that can change the course of a life. It wasn't just about food. It was about something far greater, the restoration of humanity in the midst of war. As weeks turned into months, the effects of that strange meal rippled through the lives of the female German POWs in America. The simple act of sharing a bowl of soup had done more than just fill their stomachs. It had provided a spark, a glimmer of light in an otherwise dark and oppressive reality. What was once a routine of survival, day after day, now began to take on a new dimension. It was as if that small, seemingly insignificant act of kindness had unlocked a deep well of resilience in these women. They began to find strength not just in their bodies, but in each other. In the days following the meal, the atmosphere in the camp began to shift. The women, once isolated and wary of their captors, began to open up, if only a little. Some of them started to engage in quiet conversations, exchanging stories of their families, their homes, their lives before the war. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices low, but their words carrying a weight of shared experience. Even in captivity, in a place where hope was scarce, they found ways to connect. But it wasn't just the POWs who felt the change. The guards, too, began to notice something different. There were still soldiers, still tasked with overseeing the prisoners, but something had shifted in their perception. The women they had once viewed as enemies were now, in some small way, people they could empathize with. For the first time, the guards saw them as human beings, not just captives of war. It wasn't an overnight transformation. No, this was a gradual process, a subtle shift in the way the camp operated, in the way the prisoners were treated. In the weeks that followed, the guards began to offer small gestures of kindness. Nothing grand, nothing that would risk their own standing, but gestures nonetheless. A little extra food here, a word of encouragement there. Sometimes, when the women were sick or injured, a guard might offer a kind word or even help them to the camp's infirmary. It was a far cry from the indifference and cruelty that had characterized the early days of their captivity, but it was a start. One of the most striking examples of this transformation occurred during a particularly cold winter. The women had been working outside, gathering wood for the camp, their fingers numb from the biting wind. The guards had noticed their discomfort, but instead of turning a blind eye as they had in the past, one of the officers came to them with blankets and hot water bottles. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make a difference. It was enough to show the women that they weren't invisible, that their suffering had been acknowledged. The women, for their part, were wary at first. They had learned not to trust their captors, not to rely on any act of kindness. But over time, they began to recognize the sincerity behind these small gestures. They began to understand that their survival wasn't just about food or escape. It was about maintaining their dignity, their humanity, in a world that had stripped so much away from them. The change didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the camp. The women who had been isolated in their barracks began to venture out more, engaging with one another and even with the guards. The emotional walls that had been built around them, walls of fear, distrust, and despair, began to crumble bit by bit. And as the walls came down, the women started to feel a sense of solidarity, a sense of community that had been missing in the early days of their captivity. For many of them, the small acts of kindness were enough to ignite a sense of hope. Hope, after all, is a fragile thing, easily crushed under the weight of war and suffering. But it is also a powerful force. It is what keeps people going when everything else seems lost. It is what allows them to endure the unimaginable and survive. And for the female POWs, it was this hope, the hope that they were not forgotten, that they were not defined by their status as prisoners, that would help them survive the war. As the months passed, the camp began to change in other ways. The women, now united in their shared experiences, began to take on roles of leadership within the camp. They organized themselves, helping one another with tasks and offering support during times of illness or injury. They created a network of solidarity, a community within the confines of their captivity. They began to teach each other skills that would help them survive, how to make the most of their meager rations, how to stay healthy despite the harsh conditions, how to maintain their mental and emotional well-being in the face of overwhelming adversity. It was in this environment of solidarity and hope that many of the women found the strength to endure. The meal, which had seemed so small and insignificant at the time, had acted as a catalyst, a turning point that sparked something within them. It was as though the meal had reminded them that they were not alone, that they were still part of a larger world, and that their survival was not just about food and shelter, but about the connections they made and the bonds they formed. But perhaps the most profound impact of this meal was the way it transformed the women's perception of themselves. Before the meal, they had been prisoners in the truest sense of the word. They had been stripped of their identities, their dignity, and their sense of self-worth. But after the meal, something had changed. They began to see themselves not as victims, but as survivors. They began to reclaim their humanity in a world that had tried to strip it away. The meal had given them more than just food. It had given them something that was just as important, a sense of self-worth. It reminded them that they were more than just prisoners, more than just the sum of their circumstances. They were women, individuals with hopes, dreams, and memories. And that realization, that reclaiming of their identity, was perhaps the most powerful thing the meal had given them. As the war neared its end, the women's situation began to improve. The camp was eventually liberated, and the POWs were sent home. But the memory of that strange meal stayed with them. It was a memory of kindness in the midst of cruelty, of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility for light. And for these women, that meal had been their light. Years later, when the women spoke about their experiences, they often recalled that meal. It had become a symbol of survival, of hope, and of the strength of the human spirit. It wasn't just the food that had saved them, but the recognition that, even in the worst of circumstances, they were still human, still worthy of compassion and kindness. That meal, that small act of kindness, had been their lifeline. The ripple effects of that meal were felt far beyond the walls of the POW camp. The story of the soup, of the kindness shown by the guards, and the hope it inspired in the prisoners, became a story of inspiration. It reminded people everywhere that, even in the darkest moments, the simplest acts of kindness can make all the difference. It was a lesson in humanity, in empathy, and in the power of hope. In the years that followed, the women who had been part of that camp stayed in touch, forming bonds that would last a lifetime. They met in person whenever they could, sharing their stories and memories of their time as POWs. And each time they met, they would talk about that strange meal, that one meal that had changed everything. It wasn't just the food. It was the way it had brought them together, the way it had reminded them that they were still human, still worthy of kindness. And that lesson, more than any other, is what they carried with them for the rest of their lives. The meal had done more than fill their stomachs. It had filled their hearts with hope and it had given them the strength to survive. As the war continued, the stories of the female POWs in America began to fade from the public's eye, replaced by the ever-shifting tides of military strategy, bombings, and political upheaval. However, the experiences of these women, their suffering, their resilience, and the remarkable moments of humanity they encountered lived on. For the women who had been in that particular POW camp, that strange meal would always remain a cornerstone of their survival. It would become a story they would pass down, an enduring testament to the power of simple acts of kindness in the most desolate of situations. The years following their release brought challenges of a different sort. As they returned to civilian life, many of them had trouble reintegrating. The world had changed so drastically since they had been captured, and the scars, both physical and emotional, ran deep. For the women who had survived the camps, there was no way to truly erase the trauma of their experiences. And yet, in the years that followed, the lessons they learned in captivity would begin to shape their lives in profound ways. Some of these women, for the first time, began to fully grasp the psychological impact of their time in the camps. The trauma, which had once seemed so distant, now began to rear its head in the form of recurring nightmares, a persistent sense of distrust, and an overwhelming feeling of isolation. For others, the challenge was more subtle. They struggled with the weight of what they had endured and the emotional burden of having survived while others had not. Yet, despite all of these challenges, there was one thread that connected them all: that meal. The lesson that had been learned, that the smallest act of compassion could shift the course of a life, would reverberate through the lives of these women for years to come. It was an emotional connection that transcended borders. The meal became a symbol of survival, not just in the literal sense, but in the emotional and psychological sense as well. The bond that had been formed in that POW camp, in that brief moment of shared humanity, became an anchor for many of these women. They had found something in each other, something unspoken but incredibly powerful. It was a bond that allowed them to move forward, even in the face of intense personal and collective hardship. As time went on, some of the women began to tell their stories, not just of war, but of survival, of humanity in the face of cruelty, and of how, in the worst of circumstances, they had found hope in the unlikeliest of places. These women, though scattered across different countries, connected through shared experiences, forging a network that spanned continents. They began to meet regularly, exchanging stories and lessons learned from their time in the camps, finding comfort in one another's company. But what really stood out in these gatherings was how often the story of the meal was shared. It wasn't just a tale of how a bowl of soup had been the catalyst for change. It was a story of how that single act of kindness had transformed their perspective on life itself. It was as if the meal had planted the seed of compassion, and that seed had grown, blossoming into a philosophy that guided them in the years to come. The women began to see the world through a new lens. They recognized that every act of kindness, no matter how small, had the potential to change lives. The ripple effect of the meal had not only impacted their survival, but had shaped their values and actions long after the war had ended. One woman, who had returned to Germany after her release, started working with children who had been affected by the war. She began to incorporate the lessons she had learned from her time in the camp into her work. She would often talk about the importance of compassion, empathy, and the need for kindness in a world that seemed so intent on dividing people. She would tell her young students about that meal, explaining how it was a symbol of hope and humanity, a lesson that had saved her life. Another woman, who had resettled in the United States, became an advocate for the rights of refugees. She used her platform to speak about the importance of hospitality and the need for compassion in the face of crisis. She often referenced the meal as a turning point in her own life, using it as a metaphor for how a small act of kindness could create an entirely new reality for someone in need. In these ways, and countless others, the lesson of the meal continued to live on, long after the war had ended. It was no longer just a memory of a single event in a POW camp. It had become a philosophy, a guiding principle for how these women chose to live their lives. They understood that kindness wasn't just a luxury or a moral choice. It was a vital tool for survival, a means of reclaiming humanity in a world that often seemed devoid of it. As the decades passed, the world around them changed. Many of the women grew older, their health deteriorating from the years of hardship they had endured. Yet, even in their final years, they remained connected to the lessons of the past. The meal was a constant thread in their lives, a story that was told again and again to their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The legacy of that strange meal was passed down through the generations, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a possibility for light. The story of the meal also reached a wider audience, eventually becoming a part of the greater historical narrative. Researchers and historians began to learn about the experiences of female POWs during World War II, and many of the women who had lived through it were invited to share their stories. The meal became a symbol in a larger conversation about war, survival, and humanity. It was used as an example of how even in the most brutal circumstances, people could find ways to connect, to show kindness, and to survive. And yet, despite the broader recognition of their experiences, the women who had lived through the war remained humble. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as survivors. And for them, the greatest testament to their survival wasn't the medals they had earned or the recognition they received. It was the lessons they had learned along the way. The lesson that a single act of kindness could change the course of a life. That lesson was the true victory. In the end, the women who had been in that camp, the women who had survived the hardships of captivity and found hope in a bowl of soup, would always remember that moment. They would remember it not just as a moment of physical survival, but as a moment of emotional awakening. It had been a reminder that, no matter how dire the circumstances, kindness and compassion were always worth holding on to. And so, the legacy of that strange meal continues to this day, a reminder that even in the most challenging times, the smallest acts of kindness can make all the difference. It serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of hope, and to the idea that, no matter what, we are all connected. The meal wasn't just about survival. It was about the restoration of humanity, one bowl at a time.